Virtually everything we know about the very early church, I'm talking about the first generations of the church, comes from the epistles written by Paul, and those mostly, particularly written by Paul, and those that are attributed to him. The word they use for church, or that we translate church in Greek, is ekklesia. And ekklesia means a gathering or an assembly. In all of Jesus's teachings to the disciples and the wider community, he only uses that word twice, ekklesia. And both of those examples are in Matthew, including the one we heard today. Although Jesus's message is short, it is fundamental to our common life. Jesus allows that two people may never be able to resolve a dispute between them, but he insists that we try, and he lays out a process in the church for us to follow. Now, Jesus doesn't specify what sin might be involved, and Paul gives us a list in his letter to the Romans of possible sins. They're all involved, they're all covered in the Ten Commandments: theft, adultery, murder. But even lesser sins can be matters of serious dispute. And what is implicit in what Jesus says is that if two people stubbornly refuse to be reconciled to one another, it's violating that overarching commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. If we refuse to listen to someone, refuse to attempt to compromise or be reconciled with someone, we are refusing to love him or her as much as we love ourselves. To put it more personally, if I refuse to listen to someone, even to attempt to compromise or become reconciled to someone, I am refusing to love him or her as much as I love myself. Ouch. The fact is, there's nothing more destructive to human society than a failure to face conflict and work to resolve it. As Pastor Carl Jacobson wrote, we simply don't know how to live together, fight together, and stay together. And this is because we, all of us, not just our brother or sister, not just somebody else, we all are sinners. And when I think back 2,000 years to the original audience for this, I think how differently they lived from us. How they could never have imagined worshiping in a beautiful place like this. They were in secret. Nevertheless, what we have in common is we're human beings. We have the same faults, the same strengths, the same foibles as the people from throughout history, which is why these scriptures and the Ten Commandments still apply after all these millennia, because they speak to the truth of the human condition. Jesus knew that a conflict between two people can grow to infect a whole congregation and more beyond that. Now, our own history teaches us that. In the Civil War, many denominations divided along lines of the different sides on slavery. And even 20 years ago, in this church, the Episcopal Church, we lost several congregations, and for a while, even a diocese, in conflict over the issues of ordination of gay people and the blessing of same-sex marriages. Those conflicts are playing out in other denominations still today. Nationally now, and much more dangerously, outside of the church, in the culture as a whole, disagreements have risen to the level of a crisis of trust in the integrity of elections and in the rule of law. This is so serious that on Thursday, the George W. Bush Presidential Foundation led 12 other presidential foundations, and they issued together a shared statement of their concern about the health of American democracy. Now, you can read that on bushcenter.org, or I'm including a link in the printed version of this sermon, which will be posted online. It was a break with tradition. It was precedent setting for presidential libraries and foundations to address current politics. But they did so out of concern. And one of the things they did was to urge us, among other things, to engage in civil discourse. Engage in civil discourse. Jesus called us to a lot more than civility. Jesus called us to love. Love of neighbor, love of enemies. Furthermore, as followers of Jesus, we are called to promote reconciliation. Reconciliation of people with God and with one another. That's our vocation as Christians. And we can do that individually by attending carefully to and lovingly to one misunderstanding in a relationship, one disagreement, one at a time. As I was running through this sermon, I thought, oh, I need to take care of that one, and that one, and that one. And we can do the same here together. This congregation is healthy because it has done the hard work of resolving conflict in the past. That has built a foundation of trust here, which can help us as members have the courage to deal with conflict maturely, to face one another individually in love, or with others as mediators if necessary. That process was Jesus' gift to the church. And he assured us that in times like that, which are so fraught, who wants to face conflict avoidance, that God is present. The blessing of God, the reconciling presence of God is present. And our collect for the day addresses that. Grant us, O Lord, to trust in you with all our hearts. When we come together as members of a congregation, God is in our midst because instead of trusting ourselves, we're turning it over. We're trusting God to help us resolve whatever conflict arises. Peacemakers and communities of love and trust are ever more vital in this time of polarization. Now, COVID wasn't the beginning of our divisions, but it made them so much worse. For 3 years, all of our ordinary social interactions were deeply, deeply affected. In a climate of legitimate fear, of course we were afraid. It was a deadly disease. We were separated from one another and from some of the people we were closest to, just for protection, for their protection. At Emmanuel, if we felt safe enough to come, we stayed apart, covered our faces, didn't shake hands, much less hug each other, and we kind of scurried off at the end of the services. Our core ministry, that we suspended our core ministries and social traditions like soups on and potlucks, even Bible study and coffee hour for a while. If we think about how that affected our relationships, if we think about the damage that those kinds of separations did in that long rupture, and if we multiply that by many, many millions of communities and organizations all over the country, in schools and sports and visual and performing arts, social clubs, scouts, you name it, we can begin to see and understand how much the fabric of American society was stressed and rent, and how patiently we need to attend to its healing. God willing, the worst of the COVID threat has receded. But the damage from that period lingers everywhere. At Emmanuel, we are blessed to be a fundamentally healthy body. And the social muscles we had as individuals and as a group did atrophy somewhat from lack of use, but we're rebuilding them, thanks be to God. But what about the millions of people who have no loving community to go to? Washington Post op-ed columnist Perry Bacon wrote a heart-rending plea about that this week. He had always been an active churchgoer. Before COVID, he was slowly drifting away from his congregation for a variety of reasons, including what I would consider, ordinary doubts about faith. Then his pastor refused to let gay parishioners leave ministries. He was hurt and confused by that because it didn't make sense to him for followers of Jesus to be exclusive. And so now Bacon puts himself in the ever-growing class of nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. People of no faith. But he longs for the weekly companionship that the church community gave him, and he went every week. He yearns to belong to a community again. He even wrote about thinking about creating a church of the nuns, but to bring people together. This and every city is filled with people like Perry Bacon who want to belong and who don't know where to start. We can do something about that. We can look around us in our neighborhoods and in the other places that we work or socialize or volunteer. Look around us and take the risk of reaching out, not only to invite, but to bring someone to church, because that's what works. You know that. Think of it as a ministry. It is. Let's develop that muscle. Emmanuel Church is a beautiful place, and it is a treasure house of relationships built over decades and generations. Here's Sylvia Brown, a fourth generation in this church. There's Bobby, who's third generation in this church. That's a treasure. And people like me who come in, me and Claudia, we come in 5 years ago, and we feel the embrace of that long-term body of relationships. So one of the things that we as a congregation can do to help reknit the fabric of the society, help recreate relationships of trust, and build the spiritual health of this city and this society as a whole, is to share the gift of belonging to this community of love and service. Amen.